The sky of Manila wept that afternoon. Dense, relentless drops struck the asphalt like tears the world could no longer contain. At the entrance of Manila Cathedral, she huddled. 64 years marked in the lines of her face, an improvised cardboard umbrella over her head, invisible to the hurried passers-by. Maria Delgado had not planned to end up like this. Widowed 8 months ago, evicted 3 months ago. Her husband, a lifelong fisherman, had departed during a storm, leaving no pension or insurance. Only memories and debts that now weighed more than the bags of belongings at her side. Cars passed by, splashing dirty water on her legs, already wounded by life on the streets. Her hands, once strong and hard-working, now trembled with cold and hunger. The rosary wrapped around her fingers was her only remaining wealth. Inside the cathedral, an important meeting was taking place. Bishops, authorities, and Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle himself were discussing administrative matters of the diocese. Theoretical problems of a world that seemed so distant from the soaked reality of the sidewalk. Maria observed the imposing cathedral door as one contemplates the frontier between two worlds. A world of shelter, dignity, and hope, and her own, of abandonment, cold, and forgetfulness. With a deep sigh, she gathered what little strength remained and climbed the wet steps toward that door. The security guard hesitated upon seeing her enter. A disheveled, soaked figure stands out in any formal environment. Maria felt the stares. Pity, discomfort, judgment. She recognized them all. She had become an expert at interpreting the many faces of indifference. The meeting had just ended. Important people in impeccable attire circulated through the central corridor. Maria remained leaning against a side column, trying to dry herself with a small, already wet handkerchief. Her presence, a subtle stain in the sacred setting, like a dissonant note in a perfect harmony. Cardinal Tagle emerged from a side door, surrounded by advisors. His serene face carried the weight of 1,000 decisions. 57 years old and a life dedicated to serving the church and the poor. Known for his simplicity and empathy, but also for the administrative rigor necessary for a leader of his stature. It was just an instant. A moment when their gazes crossed across the hall. The cardinal interrupted his walk for a fraction of a second. Something in that woman's gaze spoke louder than all the conversations around him. A wounded dignity, but not destroyed. Maria had mentally rehearsed a request for help, an explanation of her situation. But when her eyes met the cardinal's, all the prepared words evaporated. Only the eloquent silence of someone who no longer has the strength to beg, only to exist, remained. The advisors continued their march toward the exit. Tight schedules, important commitments, the world spinning at its relentless pace. But Cardinal Tagle remained motionless for a few more moments. A statistic became a person before his eyes. Maria lowered her gaze. Decades of humiliation had taught her not to expect much from the world. Her body trembled slightly, not just from the cold of wet clothes, but from the exposure of her vulnerability in a place where she did not feel worthy of being. Shame, that invisible burden of the poor. The cardinal dismissed his companions with a discreet gesture. Without fanfare, without announcement, he headed toward where Maria remained leaning. His steps echoed on the cathedral's marble floor like a metronome marking the rhythm of a decision already made in his heart before his mind could process it. The distance between them, physical and social, diminished with each step. The few faithful present in the cathedral observed the scene with curiosity. The contrast was evident. The red vestment of the cardinalate and the soaked rags of poverty walking toward an unlikely encounter. When he finally stood face to face with Maria, Cardinal Tagle did not say a word. He simply extended his hands and lightly touched the shoulders of that woman broken by life. A simple gesture that carried the weight of recognition. You exist, you matter, you are seen. The cardinal's office had never received someone like Maria. The walls decorated with religious symbols and framed diplomas seemed displaced from the raw reality she carried in her wet clothes. An employee brought a towel and a cup of hot tea. Small acts of dignity that seemed like mountains to someone living in the valleys of misery. Maria told her story without self-pity. The fisherman husband. The illness that consumed their savings. The eviction. Children scattered around the world, unable or unwilling to help. Daily survival on the streets of Manila, where elderly like her became urban ghosts, visible only when they disturbed. The cardinal listened, not as one fulfilling a pastoral obligation, but as one who truly hears. Without taking notes, without interrupting with quick solutions, without looking at the clock. The power of full attention. A luxury rarely granted to the invisible. Maria's hands, rough and wrinkled, held the cup like a fragile treasure. Those fingers had worked, loved, prayed, fought, and finally begged. An entire life encoded in the lines and calluses of those palms, now absorbing the tea's warmth like a dried plant absorbs the first drop after a long drought. When she finished her account, Maria expected the usual responses. An indication of temporary shelter, perhaps some change, at most a vague promise of prayer. It was the protocol of the compassionate. The possible charity in a world where problems are always bigger than the available solutions. The sun was beginning to set when Cardinal Tagle took his coat and an umbrella. With a gesture, he invited Maria to accompany him. Not to the back door, as she expected, but through the main entrance. They walked side by side, the religious leader and the homeless woman, as if they were old acquaintances strolling after a cordial visit. The security guards tried not to show surprise. The few journalists waiting outside for some statement about the administrative meeting quickly realized they were witnessing something unusual. Cell phone cameras began to record the moment, without fully understanding its significance. The official car waited at the entrance. The driver opened the door automatically. Maria hesitated, like an animal suspecting a gentle trap. The cardinal simply waited, patient, without imposing his will or rushing the decision. Respect for autonomy, even when dressed in rags. The streets of Manila passed by the window like a film about urban inequality. From the majestic cathedral to the narrow alleys where poverty accumulated like the residue that society prefers not to see. Maria indicated the way with timid gestures. The driver followed in silence, witness to a journey that transcended mere physical displacement. They arrived at a vacant lot where dozens of improvised shacks sheltered an entire community of forgotten people. Barefoot children stopped their games to observe the unusual vehicle. Elderly emerged from the shadows, curious. A cardinal visiting the earthly purgatory, an event rare enough to temporarily suspend the routine of survival. Cardinal Tagle was not prepared for what he saw. Theorizing about poverty in diocesan meetings was one thing, witnessing it in its raw form, something completely different. The smell of open sewage, accumulated garbage, the empty gaze of children for whom hope was too abstract a concept. Reality without institutional filters. Maria was not the only elderly widow in that community. 5 other women shared a shack of tarpaulin and cardboard that barely protected them from the rain. They survived on small jobs, sporadic donations, and solidarity among the equally poor. That invisible economy of sharing that exists only at the margins of society. Instead of making promises or speeches, the cardinal simply sat on the beaten earth floor. He listened to stories, held calloused hands, played with suspicious children. His red attire quickly stained with the dust and moisture of the place, the ecclesiastical authority becoming vulnerable accessible, human. When night fell completely, someone lit a small fire. In the dancing light of the fire, anonymous faces from poverty statistics gained names, stories, dignity. The cardinal shared a simple meal, without ceremony or protocol. Bread divided among equals. The symbolism was not lost on those present. Before leaving, he did something no one expected. He took off his shoes and left them beside the space where Maria slept. A pair of well-preserved shoes, insignificant to some, but a treasure in that context. The silent gesture echoed louder than any sermon. The cardinal walked barefoot to the car, feeling for the first time the same ground that those people stepped on daily. The next morning, the image circulated on social media. A barefoot cardinal leaving a slum. Phones rang incessantly at the archdiocese office. Journalists sought explanations. Politicians wanted to associate with the gesture. Critics questioned the effectiveness of symbolic acts in the face of structural problems. Cardinal Tagle gave no interviews or explanations. He simply cancelled 3 days of appointments and returned to the community. This time not alone, but accompanied by volunteer doctors, social workers, and some young seminarians. Not for a protocol visit, but to work. In 72 hours, documents were regularized, medical consultations conducted, stories recorded. The churchyard was opened to temporarily shelter the most vulnerable. Donations began to arrive spontaneously, first from the local Catholic community, then from people of all religions and even atheists touched by the authenticity of the gesture. Maria observed everything with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, not just for herself, but for others. The collective invisibility had been broken. The cardinal could have helped only her. It would already be extraordinary. But upon seeing an entire invisible system of exclusion, he chose to see everyone. True compassion always expands. What began as a casual encounter was transforming into a movement. International newspapers reported on the Barefoot Cardinal of Manila. Religious leaders of other denominations visited impoverished communities in their own cities. The personal gesture reverberated in collective actions, like a stone thrown into still waters whose waves expand in ever-widening circles. 6 months later, Maria no longer lived on the streets. A small housing program for the elderly had been implemented, the result of a partnership between the church and local businesspeople who had been moved. Nothing luxurious, just the basics for a dignified existence. A roof, a bed, a table, a chair. The minimum that should be everyone's right. Cardinal Tagle was called to the Vatican. Some feared reprisals for his media exposure. Others bet on a promotion. He returned with a challenge: to implement a program of care for abandoned elderly in various dioceses around the world. The ecclesiastical bureaucracy moving slowly, but moving. Maria now worked a few hours a week in a small community garden created on the grounds of the local parish. Her knowledge about plants, accumulated over decades of life, finally found a space for appreciation. Her hands, once extended to beg, now cared for the earth and harvested fruits. Dignity also resides in the power to contribute. On the walls of Maria's modest apartment, a single photograph, her alongside the cardinal, both with soil-stained hands, planting an olive seedling in the community garden. She didn't keep it out of vanity or as proof of proximity to someone important, but as a reminder that the improbable sometimes happens, that the visible and the invisible can coexist in the same frame. The cardinal's shoes remained with her. She didn't wear them. They would be too big for her small feet. She kept them as a symbol, not as a religious relic, but as a testament to a moment when someone chose to walk, even if briefly, in her reality. And in that shared walk, both discovered that the true distance between people is never measured in status or wealth, but in the willingness to feel the same ground beneath bare feet. If you like this kind of story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next videos.